Immortality is part of the package when it comes to being a vampire. And it's a pretty good perk. In fact, it's one of the things that you or I might really consider if we were asked, do you want to become a vampire or not? And living forever does sound pretty great, even if you have to deal with vampire hunters every 100 years or so coming to try and kill you. But there are some downsides, and there are some drawbacks, and there are some logistics to consider. So let's talk about the good and the bad when it comes to immortality and how it pertains to your vampire project. Vampires are immortal beings going on age after age as empires rise and fall and entire generations of mere mortals are born, grow up, and die. What is that like? And how do we as creators get in the mindset of that when our own lives only last for like a couple of decades? I think that the answer can be found sort of in two parts. The first part is a bit of a thought experiment into the logistics of immortality. So we'll go through that first. And then the second part is the emotional effects of immortality and how we as creators can get ourselves into that emotional headspace. So let's start with part one, which is the logistics of immortality. So let's think about this. What would it take to exist indefinitely in this modern day society without attracting the attention of vampire hunters? And most vampire stories don't even deal with this, and really yours doesn't have to either. But if you give some thought to this, it will make your vampire characters all the stronger. So your vampire has stopped aging. How does this affect their relationships? Not to mention the fact that they likely can only hang out at night anymore. If your vampire was married or has kids at the time where they turn and become immortal, then that's pretty much a non-starter. Either your wife and kids or your husband and kids are going to be in on the secret, or if your vampire wants to protect them and hide the fact that they've become a being of darkness and undead thirsting for blood, then they have to basically disappear from their family's lives. If your vampire is not in a situation like that when they become a vampire, then acquaintances and friends who don't live with them can probably be held at arm's reach and still interacted with for at least 10 to 20 years before it becomes real obvious that the vampire has stopped aging. Once you kind of cross over that threshold and all of the people who are your age are definitely looking older and you are not, then that is the point when your vampire has a choice to make. And that choice is likely going to have to be to disappear from everyone in their life so that they are no longer attracting attention for not aging. After that point, everyone in the vampire's circle falls into kind of two categories, and that is those who are in on the vampire's secret and those who are not. And those who are not, at a certain point, need to stop seeing the vampire. Now, the one caveat to this that comes to mind is a subgenre of the vampire story, which is urban fantasy. And urban fantasy is, for those who are not familiar, it's essentially what True Blood is, where urban fantasy assumes the fact that vampires, werewolves, fairies, mummies, wizards, all of these types of supernatural beings are somewhat commonplace in the world, and the rest of the world kind of recognizes that they're there and that they exist. In True Blood, the vampires have come out of the coffin, as it were, so they're not needing to hide their existence anymore. And if that's the case, then that's a completely different story. And trying to hide the fact that they're a vampire is something that your character probably doesn't have to do. But if you're not telling a full-on urban fantasy story, then that vampire has some decisions to make. Now, this is also predicated on the idea that your vampire has stopped aging. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. I mean, even if we look at Dracula, the Count, who appears fairly old and gray-haired in the beginning of the book, when Harker comes to Dracula's castle, Dracula changes over the course of the story and uses either some sort of vampiric power or some sort of magic or sorcery to de-age and to reverse his age. And if you have a vampire that is capable of physically shifting their age, then this also becomes less of a concern. But only you will know if that's the case in your vampire project. Ultimately, though, if your vampires stop aging from the point at which they turn, such as in True Blood, Twilight, then they will need to physically remove themselves from their environment long enough for those who are left behind to be able to convincingly assume that when the vampire shows back up again, they're either someone who looks a lot like that person that they used to know, or is a descendant of the person that they used to know. And we see this in Twilight, and Stephenie Meyers had consideration for this, when she showed that the Cullens, after a couple of years of their kids going to high school, they would have to pick up stakes and move someplace else. Did I just make a pun there? And that's an important consideration. And then the next time they would come back to one of their locales was when everybody else who remembered them was either too old to be convinced that they were the same people, or they could pass themselves off as the descendants of the original Cullens. If you're interested in reading a book that that sort of deals with all of this, minus the vampire angle, there's a story called Tuck Everlasting. And there have been a couple of adaptations of this. The one that I originally saw was on Nickelodeon back when I was a kid in the 80s. But there was a recent film like 10 or 15 years ago starring Alexis Bledel and Sissy Spacek and Victor Goddamn Garber. But the story is specifically about a family of immortals who just have to kind of keep traveling around. And in the actual book, they show up to this town where they haven't been in 20 or 30 years, and the young teenage boy in the family falls in love with this teenage girl who has just moved to town. And they have this relationship, but the family can't stay. So there is this question about, do we make the girl immortal as well and take her with us? Or do we keep this secret to ourselves and just leave, and she has to deal with the heartbreak? And the ending is actually, it's actually very compelling. I won't tell you how it ends, but I really dug it. But anyway, so that's, if you're at all into the Twilight books, there are some very definite echoes of that in Tuck Everlasting. And it's a real good example of having to keep on the move in order to keep your immortality a secret. Now, returning to a place and posing as the sort of younger relative of the person who left before is sort of the most obvious thing to do, but you may come up with some more creative ways to do that, and that's great. But something that you're going to have to give some consideration to is how your vampire transfers their wealth and all of their property and holdings. But Sean, I don't care about my vampire's investment portfolio. I just need him to own this super cool nightclub and terrorize my protagonist and be hot. I want those things too. And we don't need to figure out what mutual funds your vampire prefers, but you do need to address somewhere how your vampire has accumulated their wealth. And the difference between a reader going, "What?" or "Okay, I buy it," is just a single sentence. But it needs to be in there. Otherwise, at some point your reader might start going, "Wait a second, so this vampire looks like they're 22, but they own a nightclub in Chelsea, and they drive a Lamborghini around Manhattan, one of the most expensive places in the world to live. They've got a werewolf butler. Wait, how are they able to swing all this in a society that doesn't expect people that young to have that kind of stuff?" Because I guess werewolf butlers aren't cheap. I don't know why I put that last bit in there. So how does your vampire afford all of this? If you're Dracula, you afford it by going out on St. George's night, and everywhere where you see a little blue flame on the ground, you dig up buried treasure. But if for some reason your vampire doesn't live in a buried treasure-rich environment, then we gotta kind of come up with something else. Luckily, money accumulates interest over time. So if your vampire puts some money away, then they will just have more money the longer that they exist. And a really good example of all of this, and well, pretty much everything that is has to do with immortality that is not necessarily vampire related, is a movie called Highlander. So for all of the creators out there who are my age, you're like, yeah, it is. But for those of you who might be a bit younger and haven't seen it, definitely check it out. None of the sequels, absolutely none of the sequels, but the first movie, Highlander, with Christopher Lambert and Clancy Brown, who you will recognize from SpongeBob, as well as Sean Connery, it is a masterclass in immortality. And in the movie, our main protagonist, who is Connor MacLeod, who is an immortal, every 30 years or so, he fakes his own death and leaves his entire inheritance to a kid who has died in childbirth, but who has a birth certificate and a social security number and everything like that. And then Connor then takes on the identity of that kid and inherits all of the wealth that he has left to himself, and then he just keeps on going. But we can also look to Anne Rice for examples of this. In Interview with the Vampire, Lestat turns Louis into a vampire for seemingly very romantic and poetic reasons. But one of the differences between the book versus the movie is that in the book we learn that one of the other reasons Lestat has turned Louis is because Lestat needs money, and Louis is rich. And that becomes a very regular part of the discourse between the two of them. It's later revealed in later books that Lestat actually does have his own fortune that he was given when he turned. And then Lestat basically takes that entire fortune and gives it to a particular law firm, and who don't ask any questions at all because of the size of the money. And they just hold on to it for him and invest it for him. And so that fortune just keeps growing over time. And he just regularly sends them letters and says, I need this amount of money for this thing. Or please send this amount of money to this particular person. And in Queen of the Damned, we see that Maharet, who is thousands of years old, does a very similar thing like in Highlander, where she continues to leave her inheritance to theoretical descendants of herself, so that she is always able to keep the family fortune and keep it growing. Your vampire might own a company with wealthy holdings. It might be a trust, or it might be a nonprofit, or it might be something that your vampire just created and built at the turn of the century, and now it's a household name. Or your vampire's money doesn't have to come from business at all. It could be that your vampire followed the clues to an ancient buried treasure or lost civilization or something like that. It could be that your vampire buried their own treasure. I mean, if you were Dracula in the 1400s and you buried a chest full of money from that time period and little artifacts and things like that, and then came back 600 years later and dug it up, that stuff would be priceless. You'd just have to get along in the intervening years between then. It could be that your vampire won a silver mine in a card game back in the Wild West. Or it could be that they have suddenly accumulated a bunch of shares in a tech giant, not because your vampire knows anything about technology, but because they've offered to make the CEO immortal. Ultimately, it doesn't matter so much where the money comes from, as long as you know where it came from, just so that the audience can relax about it. And you might find out that the source of the vampire's money is the perfect target for a clever vampire hunter. It should also be said that your vampire doesn't need to have money at all. There's something very compelling about the idea of the bloodsucker who is broke and only ever has whatever cash they were able to hypnotize their victims into pulling out of their wallets. Sort of a money parasite as well as an actual parasite, just barely floating along in this harsh urban environment that they're not familiar with. What We Do in the Shadows, the movie especially, is just a masterpiece on what it would be like for a group of broke-ass vampires just trying to make their way in the world. And I would do an entire episode on that. But quite frankly, Maven of the Eventide already did one, and it is perfect. So you can check that out here. So enough about money at this point. Let's get into sort of the last part of this thought experiment about logistics, and that is how your vampire interacts with the rest of the world through mortals who are in on their secret. In What We Do in the Shadows, one of the three main characters, Deacon, has a familiar who is a mortal named Jackie, who basically does all of his stuff for him. If you're watching the television show What We Do in the Shadows, then we're talking about Guillermo. In both of their cases, they're a human who is doing the vampire's laundry, their dishes, cleaning the house, going out and buying them things, taking care of their bills, running errands during the daylight, and they're doing all of this stuff not for financial gain, but because the vampire is holding a promise over their head to make them into a vampire after enough of a life of servitude. And it's played up for comedy, but it's an excellent example of what it is that a vampire has that a mortal wants in order to make a relationship between the two. And immortality doesn't even need to be the leverage that the vampire has over the human. It could be the offer of vengeance that the mortal can't get on their own, or it could be some form of supernatural gifts, or it could be the promise to protect and take care of one of the mortal's descendants. These are all reasons why a human would enter the employ of a vampire and keep their secret. But those are just kind of a smattering of very easy sort of down and dirty reasons. You could have mortals helping a vampire for far more complex and sort of altruistic reasons. You could have like a history professor who aids a vampire because the vampire has insights into a particular period that the professor is writing a book about, or is the crux of their entire profession. You could have a cop who uses the vampire on occasion for supernatural aid in capturing suspects or in hypnotizing witnesses to be more helpful. You could have a living descendant of the vampire who's just the latest in a long line of people to aid them out of familial duty. The mortal characters who aid your vampire have the potential to be really fascinating. And if you look at a movie like Let the Right One In, where your vampire character, who is Eli, is looking for a new mortal aid to help her to maintain her existence. And she finds that in young Oscar, who looks like he's a similar age to her. But all the while, her current mortal helper, Hakan, is still around. And he's having to go through the absolute heartbreaking experience of essentially watching the vampire who he loves essentially find a replacement for him. And that's devastating. On the flip side of that, you've got, you have a mortal helper in True Blood, who is someone like Ginger, who has been hypnotized so many times by Eric and Pam that she's pretty much crazy. But they would be absolutely lost without her. Highlander also gives us an example about how interesting you can get with the relationships between mortals and immortals in the character of Rachel. And if you, especially if you watch the director's cut of Highlander, you see that Rachel is the manager of Connor MacLeod's antique business. And she's, I mean, arguably in her 40s or 50s, whereas he looks like he's, you know, maybe early 30s, mid-30s, something like that. So she looks older than he does. But in the director's cut, you see a flashback to when she's like 2 years old, 4 years old, something like that, and she's in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany, and Connor shows up and wipes out the Nazis and essentially rescues her and takes her with him. And so what you're left with is this, this sort of weird dynamic of he sort of adopts her, she grows up, there is, it's never said, but could possibly be insinuated that the two of them had a love affair when she got to be a particular age, and then sort of aged past him, and then in the movie he sort of captures the interest of this younger character who is Brenda, the police metallurgist, who's sort of looking into him. And Rachel basically has to emotionally let Connor go, be with this younger woman. It's almost like she's transferred into a mother-like character. And as, you know, as uneasy as that might make any of us feel to think about and how heartbreaking it is, that's exactly the kind of story that a vampire tale can experiment with. What do relationships look like when one of the characters lives forever? And that sort of concludes our thought experiment for your vampires, and gets us into part 2 of this conversation, which is conversation. I'm just monologuing at you, really, but it's very nice of you to call it a conversation. I guess I called it a conversation, but we're getting to part 2, which is the sort of emotional aspects of living forever. And this is sort of the other half of the brain working. It's where we as vampire creators have to get in the mindset of somebody who is going to live forever and has potentially lived for centuries already. And how do we do that exactly? Now, obviously, the older you are, the easier it's going to be to tap into these feelings. But even for our younger creators out there, there are some touchstones, even in your young life, that can get you into this headspace very quickly. The first emotion is change. And for the older creators out there, this is very easy for us because it's about watching buildings disappear. It's about watching the skyline of your city or town changing. It's about watching institutions that you were always familiar with sort of dissolving away. For example, when I was younger, doing research meant going to the library and cracking open books and hoping that they had the books that you needed. There was no internet at all. Dinner was something that you most likely had with your family, and there were no cell phones at the table because cell phones didn't exist. In fact, before cell phones existed, if you weren't at work, work couldn't reach you. If you weren't at home, nobody could reach you. But those days are gone now, and it is never going back to the way that it was. For those of you who are younger, you will have experienced this when you had to move into a new house, or when you changed schools. You can always go back to the place where you were before, but you'll never belong there again. That part of your life is now closed to you forever. And that's what vampires feel all the time, over and over again. The second emotion to get us into the headspace of the vampire is loss. And I don't want to bring the mood down here, but this is sort of the most important emotional impact of immortality, and that is watching everyone you know grow old and die. And as an immortal, you are going to meet new people, but they're also going to grow old and die. Any of our creators out there who are in their 70s or 80s or 90s know exactly what this feels like, where you start watching your contemporaries, the people who you grew up with or who you've known your entire life, are starting to die. And you are becoming more and more alone in your age bracket. But then let's go a step further. After all of your kids have lived full lives, and have grown old and died, and your grandkids and then your great-grandkids have all grown old and died, and you're still here. How do you stay connected to humanity when all of your family and friend ties have long since gone? Old or young, everybody watching this has experienced some level of this before, even if it was just a cherished pet that you lost. And whomever it was, I'm very sorry for that loss. But that is the feeling that we're going for here. The idea that there was someone who you cared about, and now they're gone, and they'll never be back again. How does your vampire deal with that? The third emotion on this list is loneliness. And I know that everybody watching this has felt lonely at some point in their life. If you feel it often, I'm very sorry. And everybody, all the other vampires on this channel are certainly with you. But loneliness is a key element of immortality. It can be a crippling feeling for the vampire, causing them to become bitter or possibly even insane due to the solitude of their existence. Or it can be a powerful motivator, driving the vampire to find companionship or towards grand plans that will affect the people around them, either for good or ill. And there is a need for us as human beings to make some sort of mark on the world around us in some way, as sort of a way of showing that we were here. And I don't think that goes away for the vampire, even if they are still here. The fourth emotion is irrelevance. And this is going to be an easier one for the older creators out there. It's the feeling that your time has passed, that your knowledge and experience are no longer needed. And all of the things that you did in your life and the sacrifices you made, people don't remember. The younger generations have grown up not having any idea what you did. The conversation has essentially moved on without you. And the people who are in the know now don't want to take the time to explain it to you. They basically see you as too old and not worth the time. A great example of this is that scene in Coppola's Dracula where Gary Oldman just flies into a rage when Harker chuckles at the mention of his ancient victories. So, what do we do with all of this? I think that every vampire character is going to be affected by sort of a different cocktail of all of these things, based on their history and their experiences. But ultimately, when we take all of this and we kind of think about all of these things as pertaining to our vampire character, the thing that it boils down to is, how has your vampire been affected by immortality? And how does that inform what they decide to do about it? When you watch Interview with the Vampire, Armand tells Louis, "You have no idea how few vampires truly have the stomach for immortality." And I completely believe that. I imagine some vampires would become just bitter, reclusive hermits, like the character that Charles Dance plays in Dracula Untold. Others might lash out from their loneliness, becoming horrific monsters, just killing and torturing and trying to inflict pain, like Willem Dafoe's portrayal of Max Schreck, the vampire in Nosferatu, in the movie Shadow of the Vampire. And then others will seek to make companions to help them through the long nights. Characters like Louis, Lestat, Claudia, Carlisle Cullen. But then there's the other side of this, where the vampire chooses to take action against their long nights and against a world that has moved on without them. And this is where the grand plans of the undead seem to come from. Deacon Frost wanted to create a world where vampires reign supreme and humans are just kept in farms. Incognito wanted to tear down the vampire hunter society that was threatening him in Helsing. Valak wanted to walk in the sun in John Carpenter's Vampires. Lord Harkon wanted to blot out the sun in Skyrim. These are all healthy hobbies for the vampire master who is not happy with just rotting away in some tomb somewhere. But if we want to look to the granddaddy of all of this, we look no further than Dracula. Dracula was a forward-thinking vampire. He was a self-starter who wasn't afraid to think big. He wasn't content to just waste away, and when Transylvania became completely played out for him, he decided to get up and leave. Where to? Victorian England. That was a place that showed some promise. And he decided, in order to get there, to think outside the box, about 30 boxes as a matter of fact, but using a little bit of grit, some foresight, and an excellent application of the postal system, he made a hell of a swing for it. If it wasn't for the fact that Harker managed to escape his castle and get out and warn everyone, things might have turned out a lot different. In fact, for those of you who are interested in what England would have looked like if Dracula's plan had come to fruition, I highly recommend the Anno Dracula by Kim Newman. It's basically what if Van Helsing and the Hunters had failed and Dracula had managed to marry Queen Victoria and essentially turn England into a vampire's playground. And the result is just delicious. And anyone who is a vampire lover would absolutely love this book. Now, we've covered some pretty dark stuff in this episode. And, we've talked about all of the downsides of immortality and how to deal with it and how to make it work, make the best out of a bad situation. But for as much as the vampire genre sort of tends to steer us toward the gothic and the lonely and the sad and the brooding and the depressed and the lonely, I also think there's room for the type of person who just seems to be immune to all of that. I think about my own father, who is now in his 70s, and he's being hit with a lot of the stuff that we've talked about, but he's just not the type of person to ever feel left behind by the world. He loves technology, and he loves new stuff, and he's always excited about any sort of scientific discovery or advancement, and he's the type of guy who I think could pretty happily live for 1,000 years, especially if that means that he gets to see where humanity goes and what types of things we accomplish and what sort of diseases we eradicate and what sorts of ways we find to extend our own lives and what it's like when we get off this planet, all those sorts of things. And that's just who he is. So it's entirely possible that your vampire feels that way toward death as much as they did in life. So here we come to the end. And throughout this entire thought experiment, there are probably a couple of you out there who are thinking, yeah, but what about this last thing? This thing that is sort of a counter to the loneliness of the immortal vampire. And it's something that we find in Vampire the Masquerade and True Blood and Forever Night and the Vampire Chronicles. And that is another immortal to spend your time with. And this is the crux of almost every urban fantasy out there. And that is vampire society. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode, is what your larger vampire world is like. Who's in it? How is it run? And how does that affect your story and your characters? But in the meantime, please tell us about your vampire project. How does Immortality affect your vampire characters? You can tell us that in the comments, or if you want to go on to other social media, you can just hashtag it YVP for your vampire project so that we can find it. Your vampire dollars. So, for this particular subject, I have a bit of a secret weapon for you. This is something that most people don't know about, and so I'm going to recommend it here. And it's a movie that is called Jerome BIXBY'S The Man from Earth. I'm not sure exactly where you're going to find it right now, aside from you can order it on Amazon. I don't know if it's on any of the streaming platforms. I don't think it ever had a theatrical release. The only reason why I know about it was because it was in a film festival, the Comic-Con Film Festival, the year that I was a judge for it. And when I saw this movie, it slapped me in the face for an hour and a half and has stayed with me the entire time. And what it is Jerome BIXBY, who wrote it, was a writer for Star Trek, the original series. And it's basically a story about one person who is immortal, and it's the night that they are leaving their old life behind in order to move to a place where no one knows them. And so it's just sort of like a one night, almost kind of a theatrical experience, if you will. It all takes place in one cabin. But it is absolutely fascinating. It stars one or two Star Trek alumni. It also has Tony Todd in it, who you may remember from the Candyman movies, or The Rock, or The Crow. But it's an excellent masterclass in the life of an immortal and what it would be like. And like I say, most people don't know about this movie, so there's a lot of fertile stuff in there that you will have exclusive access to. So definitely check that one out. Jerome BIXBY'S The Man from Earth. Before we go, I just wanted to let you guys know, I recently appeared on an episode of Morbid Planet. And Erin Chapman, who runs Morbid Planet, does this video series that she calls Virgin's Views, where she watches some kind of a movie that she has never seen before and then reviews it. And in this case, she watched Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter, which is a classic Hammer horror film about vampires. And so I joined her on this episode to sort of act like, I guess, a sidekick, sort of like an Ed McMahon type character. If you've seen the movie, it's a lot of fun to watch us talk about it. If you haven't seen the movie, then go see that movie. It's fabulous. The other thing that I wanted to say is that Lucy X Mina has a website. And it's lucyxmina.com, and I'll put a link to that below. So if you want to see some stills from the movie and read a frequently asked questions about it, you can do that. By all means, check that out. Otherwise, I'll keep you updated with how it's doing in the festival circuit. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.